And joining us in the studio, and I have been informed that I did not massacre his last name, so I'm very happy to hear that, but I'm going to try to do it even better this time. We've got author Rafael Mangual.
Perfect.
Yes! I'm going home, Rhino. I'm done. That's my accomplishment for the day. Rafael, you're here with the to speak at a Mississippi Center for Public Policy event today, and you're an author of a book, and number one, I love the name because it doesn't come across spoken word. You have to see it with the parentheses around the IN for criminal injustice. Tell us a little bit, number one, first, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm born and raised in New York City, Brooklyn, and that's really relevant to the work I do today because, New York was not always the kind of big, safe city that it, became in the early aughts and mid-2000s. It still is by and large today, although we've seen a deterioration. But when I was going into kindergarten, we had 2,262 murders that year. We had 292 murders in 2017. So, I have lived my life mostly in a city that completely transformed itself. And I think, in my opinion, constitutes the single biggest achievement in urban American history. Watching that was, I think, really influential in terms of developing my own appreciation for the importance of public safety and what it can do to transform an economy. I mean, New York City, particularly the outer boroughs, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, transformed in ways that it is now unrecognizable compared to the pictures. I don't know how old your sort of median listener is, but there was this interesting moment during the 1977 World Series where Howard Cosell is announcing one of the games, and as they do, the camera zooms out from Yankee Stadium and kind of gives a little picture of the landscape, and all you saw were these fires burning all over the Bronx. And he has this really famous line where he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning," and it becomes this sort of iconic moment in New York's history where it was this moment of embarrassment where the city was just looked like a hellscape, literally, fire and brimstone, and it was not weird to have whole city blocks where maybe there was one standing structure. And all of that changed in seemingly an instant. And it was because we got one really important thing right, and that was public safety.
Well, and, number one, I think we also fall into the trap, talking about the Bronx is burning, but that was very obvious. It was on TV. But we fall into the trap of identifying the worst possible aspects of whatever we're considering or talking about and pretending that's the entirety of it. New York still has problems.
Sure.
They still have a lot of issues. Everybody has a lot of issues. Yeah. But it's more to it than that. And that stat you gave me about the murders, that's incredible.
Yeah.
How much it has dropped. But that leads into what you were saying. The one thing that you got right in New York that happened there that turned everything around economically, societally, culturally, what was it?
It was public safety. I mean, we were able to figure out a way to experiment with both policing and criminal justice policy. And those experiments basically prioritized putting resources in the highest crime enclaves of New York City and signaling to the public in those places that, hey, someone's in charge here. We're going to take this seriously. We're going to get things under control. We are not going to suffer repeat offenders to the degree that we have been throughout the 1970s and 80s. And we're going to start to take these punks off the street for really long periods of time. And what that did, I think much to the surprise of people even making these policy choices, was it gave these communities room to breathe, room to grow. And as crime started to come down, it made those places more attractive to economic investment, to business development, to real estate development. New York City became a city, was a city where parents were afraid to send their kids to NYU or Columbia, because, hey, well, are they going to ride the subway? Are they going to get mugged on the street? To a place where it's like, okay, no, I'll happily send my kid there. And then, it sort of transformed into a city where when you graduated from NYU or Columbia, it wasn't, okay, I'm going to move to LA or, Chicago or some other part of the country. It was like, no, I'm actually going to stay here. And, that, again, just, it snowballed. And this, sort of positive cycle of reinforcement just kind of took off. And, New York became just the sort of place where you could, as I did when I was in college, leave a bar at 3 a.m., walk 20 blocks with a $100 bill taped to your forehead and be fine. And that just was I think unpredicted, and the benefits were just well beyond what anyone expected. And that's one of the reasons why I think you're seeing the kind of pushback against the direction that the city is moving in now. Because as I mentioned, we got down to 292 homicides in 2017, but we're now approaching the 500 mark again, after seeing a nearly 50% increase in homicides in 2020 and then another increase in 2021. And I think that's something that lots of cities around the country are dealing with is, I think in a lot of ways, the United States is a victim of its own success because the New York formula was kind of tried in the rest of the country, and you saw crime declines kind of happen in big cities across the nation. But as crime goes down, I think you start to see a level of uncomfortableness with the incongruity between a tough system and safe streets. And so as that level of discomfort grows, people start to push back on the kind of robust systems that provided that initial level of safety to begin with. And you start to roll those things back through various reform efforts. And that rollback can then make jurisdictions increasingly more vulnerable to exactly the kind of crimes. And so, at the beginning of my book, I quote this crime historian, Eric Monkinen, who said back in the 1960s that crime would follow a sort of cyclical pattern where you would have really low levels of crime, which meant that, public safety wasn't really taken seriously. And that lack of seriousness would create the conditions for crime to rise. As crime rose and eventually got out of control, people would have a kind of draconian response to it. And that those responses would then cause crime to go down and then set the stage for the next cycle to repeat itself. And so I think that's kind of where we are. Historically speaking, in the 1950s and 60s, crime wasn't, a huge problem at the early outset. The systems weren't really in place. In the mid-1960s, it starts to tick up as a result, gets out of control in the 70s and 80s and 90s. We say, oh, my goodness, we really have to do something about this. And, there's these huge investments in policing and criminal justice over the course of the, late 80s, early 1990s. That then leads things to get brought under control. And then the reform movement, kind of refound its voice. And, we're doing it all over again. So my hope is that, by writing about these issues and, highlighting that history, the pendulum won't swing as far past the point of equilibrium this time around as it did the last time. So that, as history kind of repeats itself, we learn faster and don't make as big a mistake.
Well, I'm sure you heard me talking in the segment before you came in here about the incident on the subway in New York where the guy got choked. 44 times he had been arrested.
That's right.
And released again. You had 44 chances to where this wouldn't have had to happen. Yeah. But we didn't do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, what we often see in terms of, crime, especially in urban enclaves, is that, there's an incongruity between reality and the narrative. And the narrative is that we sort of systematically deny second chances in this country. In fact, last month was Second Chance Month in the United States. But, the reality is that people are given plenty of chances. And one question that I think we have to be more comfortable asking ourselves as a society is, are we actually helping offenders who we continue to release out into the public? And are we actually helping the communities that they're going to spend their time in? I mean, I don't think, at least with hindsight, that anyone can look at what happened on the subway and say, okay, this person who's been arrested 44 times is clearly mentally ill in a very serious way and obviously can't function within society. Was he really better off where he was, roaming the subways, asking for food, having episodes, getting himself into situations in which, he lost control and eventually created enough fear for someone to intervene in that kind of violent way? I mean, that's not the world I want to live in. We have been sort of duped as a society into believing that compassion requires this kind of leniency. The only way that argument kind of gains popular purchase is by ignoring the potential downside risks that are associated with that project. And not just the risk to the broader community, which is often how we frame this, and those are important, but also the risks to the individuals themselves. A lot of times these offenders will also become victims by virtue of the circumstances in which they live and how they carry themselves.
That's a perfect example what happened here. But I think that and we've gotten caught up in this again. We do. It's just like everything else. It's cyclical. We have gotten caught up in this compassionate kabuki theater to where we have now twisted things around to where somebody thinks it's actually a decent argument to look you in the face and go, you don't understand. We should have given him a 45th chance.
Right. Right.
And that makes sense to some people.
Yeah, what do they say about the definition of insanity, right?
Same thing, over and over and over and over, or at least 45 times in this particular case, which is part of the problem. Can you hang on through the break?
I sure can.
Fantastic. We are talking to Raphael Mangual.
Perfect.
Okay, good. I'm trying to keep my record up, Rhino. Author of Criminal Injustice, speaking at a Mississippi Center for Public Policy event in about an hour, actually. We got to get you out of here pretty quick because of traffic, if nothing else, so you can get there.
I'm sure it's nothing close to New York traffic, so I'll be all right.
Well, and you got Douglas driving.
That's right.
Yeah, just buckle the seatbelt.
Yeah, just to make sure he stays on the left side of the road. Off the left side of the road.
That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure. We have a very welcoming stance here on Middays, live in the Element Well studios. You know, I've heard so many people do this song, and I'm sorry, that's Frank's song. Everybody needs to leave it alone.
Indeed.
It's a great song, but I'm a big Rat Pack fan to begin with.
Oh, yeah,
yeah. Frank, you leave Frank alone. That's Frank's. That will be his for all eternity. Welcome back. We've got in studio with us now Raphael Mangual, author. I'm not even commenting on it anymore. I think I've got it now. Author of Criminal Injustice, and we're talking about, and we've got a text on the C Spire text line from Rick down in Gulfport, who says there's areas in East Paris where the French police don't go. It was much the same when I lived there 50 years ago. New Orleans, you know about. New York seems safer than either of those now.
It is.
But we have a tendency to focus on the sensational stories and the big things and try to make that in our mind be the entire situation. And it's not the case in New York.
No, it's not. And, you know, one of the things that is really important to do, and it's a mistake that we often make, and even I'm guilty of it sometimes, is when we talk about crime and public safety, we talk about it in aggregate terms. We talk about crime in New York, crime in Louisiana, crime in New Orleans, crime in Philadelphia. When the reality is that, you know, we don't experience crime or really anything else in the aggregate, right? I mean, you know, how safe you are is highly dependent on specifically where you are and what time it is. And so it's actually much more enlightening to look at crime statistics, not at the city level and not even really at the neighborhood level, but really at the street level. If you spend any time in any major city, you know that within the scope of a couple of blocks, the public safety picture can change radically, right? There are parts of every city where you would be well advised not to go at all, and the majority of the city is going to be safe. And so, you know, the Manhattan Institute actually did an interesting study on crime concentration in New York City that we published in 2021 that looked at the level of concentration at the street segment level. So a street segment, if you're just imagining a four-sided city block, would be corner to corner, both sidewalks is one street segment. All right. New York City has 82,000 of those approximately. About 3.5% of the street segments see 50% of all the violent crime. About 5% of the street segments see 50% of all the crime, and about 1% of the street segments see 25% of the crime, whereas 40% of the street segments don't see any crime at all in a given year. And so, you know, one of the things that we have to be really careful about when we talk about crime at the city level is, you know, the fact that we are often kind of rolling over the fact that crime is a very hyper-concentrated phenomenon geographically. It only affects a very, very small slice of the country, and it's also very hyper-concentrated demographically. So again, you know, drawing on my knowledge in New York City, every single year for which we have data, a minimum of 95% of all shooting victims in our city are either black or Hispanic. Almost all of them are males. Now, I can assure you that black and Hispanic males don't constitute anywhere close to 95% of our population. In 2021, it was 97% of shooting victims. So, you know, we have to be very, very careful about how we talk about crime. There is no American crime problem. There is no, you know, Mississippi crime problem. There is no Jackson crime problem. There is a crime problem in specific places within jurisdictions at specific times. And that's, I think, a much more elevated way of approaching the problem that's going to be, you know, much more enlightening as to the discussion about what solutions are going to work, because solutions have to be narrowly tailored to the scope of the problem. And one of the things that I don't think Americans quite fully appreciate is just that particular phenomenon. I mean, you know, across the country, about 50% of homicides will occur in about 2% of U.S. counties, and more than half of U.S. counties are not going to see any homicides in a given year. And within those counties, you know, the crime problem is even more concentrated still.
We have to find a solution for this, and I think perception plays a part in that, definitely, because we have lost sight of the ability to take kind of a gut reaction to things, a gut knowledge. and apply it to the overall problem. We want to talk in these big sweeping terms, as you said, but I'm sorry. There are some areas of wherever you're at, whatever county you're at in Mississippi, whatever city you're in, there's some part of it you wouldn't let your wife walk down the sidewalk by themselves. There's others you wouldn't have a problem, period. That's just the way it works. But we don't want to talk about that in that fashion because, well, it's insensitive.
It's insensitive and it's nuanced. And nuance, of course,
it's hard.
It's hard. It makes the conversation more difficult to have. I mean, I think one of the main reasons there's resistance to kind of acknowledging this reality of crime concentration, both geographic and demographic, is that a lot of the crime debate is framed around the idea that we should be most concerned with the racial disparities in our criminal justice enforcement statistics. We are told that, the elevated rate at which certain communities are arrested, involved in stops and frisks, are incarcerated, that this is prima facie evidence of discrimination on the part of the system, right? Systemic racism, systemic, discrimination. These disparities, are the problems that the criminal justice reform movement of today are really kind of geared toward addressing. And, one of the things that I don't think that really grapples with is this crime concentration phenomenon, because if you agree that the resources that we invest to address crime, that those resources should be concentrated where the problem is most acute, well, then you have to accept that disparities are going to arise from that, right? Again, if you're talking about New York City, where 97% of shooting victims 2 years ago were Black or Hispanic males, would it be fair to deploy as many resources to very low crime, white communities than you do to very high crime minority communities? And, I'm old. I'm still a young man, but I'm old enough to remember where one of the sort of most intense critiques of policing as an institution was that it wasn't responsive enough to crime in minority communities. I mean, I don't know how many old school hip hop fans are listening, but there's a group called Public Enemy, and one of their most famous songs, and I think it was the late 80s, was 911 is a joke. And the idea was that, the police just would take their time responding to crime in low-income minority communities, and this kind of reflected the sort of subtle racism of that institution back then. But now we live in a very different world in which resources are diverted to the places that need the most, and now we're told that the outgrowth of that phenomenon is evidence of racism still. And so it's kind of, you can't win and can only lose. But the other thing that the systemic racism critique, which is very, very powerful for people, that it gets wrong is that it's only looking at enforcement statistics as if that's the only output of the criminal justice system. But when the criminal justice system works, right, when police do their job well, when we incarcerate the right people, crime goes down. And what they never look at is who enjoys the benefits that are associated with those crime declines. And it turns out that those disparities are just as stark and just as persistent. And so I ask people often this rhetorical question: why on earth would a system allegedly designed and operated for the specific oppression of low-income minority communities so disproportionately benefit those communities when the system achieves its stated ends? Ask any police chief in the country, what is it that you want to achieve? How do you define success? They say, well, I want to control crime. I want to suppress crime. Ask any law and order prosecutor, the same thing. What motivates you to do that? Well, I want to provide public safety. Same thing with corrections officials. Well, at this point in the game, we know who suffers the most from the crime problem, which means we know who's going to benefit the most from that problem's reduction. And yet no one really addresses that incongruity.
Well, and they probably won't, let's be honest, unless their hand is forced. That's the way it works. And that's everybody. This is across the board.
Sure.
And this is a problem that's not going to go away. It has to be addressed. But at the same time, this is something that I have said many times. It's something I keep falling back on because I have identified this as one of our root problems, and I think it definitely applies to this area. We have gotten so process-oriented and focused instead of result-oriented and focused. We no longer set a goal, that's what we want to achieve, and then do what we have to do to get there. No. Goal is almost secondary because we want to make sure we do this process this way. I don't care. Make crime go down.
Right.
Let's start with that instead of focusing on making sure we do things the right way, and then hopefully things will get better. We've got to quit focusing on the process and start focusing on getting some results.
Well, if you reorient the inquiry around results, it instills a sense of accountability that a lot of people are just uncomfortable with, because now they have something to answer for. And that was actually the really great innovation of crime control efforts in New York City in the early 1990s was, Bill Bratton came into New York City and actually said, we are going to get crime under control, which immediately put himself behind the eight ball, because what happens if it doesn't happen? Oh, and by the way, crime has been going up since the late 1960s in that city, and no one's been able to get it under control. And he actually said, no, this is going to be the standard against which I will be measured. And that really put him out on a limb. And he showed that actually, if you motivate people around that result, that you can actually really motivate them in important ways and produce benefits that were just, again, incredible.
Personal accountability and working towards a good result to benefit the people that need it the most. This is crazy talk, Rafi. I don't even know what to do with you at this point. You make way too much sense to be floating around loose. Luckily, we've got Douglas out there. He's got Jan Hand and good man out there. And obviously you are as well. You're speaking today, again, in about 40 minutes, so we got to get you out of here, or I would keep you around for another hour. Rafael Mangual, author of Criminal Injustice. I have enjoyed talking to you. And
likewise.
Next time you're in this area, swing back by.
I will.
Fantastic. We will continue on Middays live in the Element Wealth Studios right after this.